The platoon leader was my great-grandfather's brother. The old guy, sitting in his rocker, held out his hand and Patricia shook it, but the guy did not let go. She thought he was thinking and wishing. Wishing? I met your great-grandpa's brother once. I was a child. Trish almost stopped breathing. He did not want to let go. Nor did she, perhaps for another reason. She realized his mind was sharp. Other things were sharp, also. We were playing up on the ridge. The one we named for him, Madman Ridge. We didn't do that much because he was up there. Our parents told us to stay away. He would watch us from up in a tree, or a hole in the ground. So many bombs went off around here there are still holes. We'd see him but he'd stay far away, unless we got too close to the lower part of the ridge. He chased us off, swinging his stick or throwing rocks. He laughed, or cackled. Anyway, one day the others all ran down the other side around the pond down there. More of a swamp, really. That's the edge of our property. I went in this direction, and suddenly he jumped me. I was 10? This would have been about 1927. She finally extricated her hand and sat on the daybed.
Jacques stood up.
9 years after the war? How'd he lived? Did he work? Did he hurt you? She asked. No, he saved me. He smelled. His clothes were just rags. He was very, very thin. You see, I was about to run into this stake sticking up out of the ground. It was hidden in the weeds and thorns, vines, but if I'd fallen on it. He shook his head. He pointed to it, walked me by it, holding both my arms, and once I was on this side of the slope, he pointed to our house here and let me go. I ran away. A few years later, I looked for the stake, but it was gone. Maybe he was growing tomatoes, he said, and laughed thinly. He had trouble getting his breath. This was exciting for him and hard. He must have been close to 100 years old. Where'd he live? How'd he live? She asked. The old guy looked at her and smiled. He liked being old. Since he got old, every woman he saw was pretty, and this American girl who just wanted to know about her kinsman was more than most. You're a flirt, Moreau, he thought to himself. He started to laugh, but it started him coughing. He blamed the Americans for the state of his lungs, too. Marlborough's, even though he quit in the 1970s. When he caught his breath, he smiled at Trish, and she thought, he's flirting. He's liking this attention. He feels more important because I want to know what he's kept locked up for decades. He would sneak down to our house in the dark, usually. Other houses toward Rochambeau. He'd go through garbage. Sometimes someone would see him by the road and leave out a coat or used clothes, some apples or leftovers. He became very thin over the years. We'd not see him for weeks on end, and then he'd turn up. Some guys saw him fishing a few times in the pond, but there's not much in there but some small stuff. A few times people saw smoke from farther up the hill, well beyond the ridge with the stakes. Trish was quiet, imagining him slowly wearing down. Homeless, exposed to the elements, deranged or obsessed or something crazy. He never hurt anyone? She asked. No, there were rumors, but no one ever claimed he hurt them. A few were tackled or knocked down, but just on that one part of the ridge. Otherwise, he'd just watch whoever was near. He'd even wave a few times, when people were far away. Trish was afraid to ask her last question. What happened to him? Mr. Moreau smiled, sadly. It was harsh in these parts the one winter. Maybe 31 to 32 or 30 to 31. I don't remember, but it's on the stone. We didn't see him at all that winter, and come spring some kids found him. Up in the rocks on the hill beyond the ridge, he'd put up some pallets and wood and built a shelter of sorts. But he froze to death, they thought, though he may have starved. His hands and feet were frostbitten before death, so he may have died either way. Trish sat back, as if she'd reached an end of sorts. Where'd they put him? She asked. The old man seemed to get a glimmer, as if he were suddenly enthusiastic. They found some papers with him. No diary, not like that, but wrapped in oilcloth and rubber sheet. In a rusty German ammunition box he must have found, not one of the wood ones. He'd gone to trouble to save it. The first paper printed in English block letters, "Please bury me on the lower ridge, with my boys." It was signed Finch. Quiet again. Then he went on, without prompting. I know all this because they gave it all to my father. Our farm, after all, and if someone come looking we'd know as much as could be known. Would you like to see the papers? His effects, if you will. Patricia jumped up, her heart racing. Oh my God, yes. Do you know how much the original documents could help? For verification? Credibility? Yes, oh please. Jacques, sitting beside her on the daybed, patted her hand and said, "In that chest, Grandpa? Yes, you know the one. And bring me a lemonade and refresh our guests." "Yes, Grandpa, of course, Grandpa. Anything you say, Grandpa," Jacques said and laughed. Trish heard him yelling then for the kids, checking on them. It was silent in the room. Trish said, "Did he leave other writings, Mr. Morrow?" He nodded. "Yes, a little military stuff no one here could make sense of. Probably because we could translate the English to French, but the jargon is not the same. So our veterans couldn't figure it. Probably not important." There was a long list of names, side by side, as if there should be a picture above it and each person identified. Then there's a page, well, here he comes now. Jacques was carrying a small wooden chest. He unlocked it with a key, saying, "I've wanted to know what was in here for all my life. At least you kept the key." His grandfather harumphed and smiled. "There should be a small ammunition box. Get that out. And at the bottom, wrapped in cloth and tied with a rope, it'll be heavier." Jacques found it. Actually a World War I German metal box for ammunition. He opened it for his grandfather, who looked in. Then he reached in with both hands to the bottom of the chest and pulled out a large package that clinked as metal. "Here, Miss Finch. It rightfully belongs to you now," said the old man, handing her the box. She found yellowed papers, a wallet that had William Finch, USA on an American identity card, some money. There was a St. Christopher medal, Army identity tags, pictures. She found the papers, sky gray platoon in big letters, listing everyone in the platoon by squad and team, as best she could figure. Not in column, but in rank side by side. Several pages, as if they should be adjoined sideways head to toe. And to the right a big rock and area he labeled Lafayette Woods. Perhaps Dr. Sims would know what to make of it. She saw the precise instructions for burial, very clear compared to the other things. There was also a note, as if wanting to explain to anyone back home why Billy Finch lived and everyone he was responsible for died. June 23, 1918. At 5:15 hours, I was at battalion briefing. Jack Johnson's? Obliterated trench. Platoon went west. I know where each man is, as I look to the north. Their gravesite is a garden of knives. Added almost as an afterthought was this statement, "Took bayonets, danger to children." She read it, did not understand some, understood too well others, and decided she'd like to talk to Dr. Sims or General Marks. Jacques opened the roped package of cloth, and there were dozens of old, rusted bayonets. "I am confused by this also. If I come back tomorrow in the morning, could you take me up on the ridge? To where he's buried, where he says his men are?" Jacques said yes, looking happy she'd be back. "Then I need to get back to Rochambeau. I have a phone call to make. I'll try to be here about 9 tomorrow, if that's okay." The old man reached out his hand, and she grasped it. He put his other hand on top. "I am glad you have come. It's time the issue be put to bed." Trish thought, is he flirting again? Did he know how those words translated? She looked in his eyes and decided he knew exactly what he was suggesting, without making it obvious. Jacques said, "Grandpa, you are a dirty old man." He laughed. Grandpa Moreau howled, but then developed a coughing fit that soon passed. His eyes were twinkling. Jacques walked her to the door. "I look forward to tomorrow. I haven't been up on the ridge in a year. We'll see what we find. I know where they buried your relative, though." Trish thanked him, looked at him a moment, and left, hesitating to look at those dark eyes again, but touching his arm. A strong arm. It was mid-afternoon, and she'd missed lunch without a thought. She thought 2 kids were following her down the lane, but she couldn't see them in the trees nor on the ground. Back at her room, she studied the papers and her GPS, her maps, and decided the spur of the hill was the last known location of the platoon. The pond or swamp was likely the one marked on the old war map, with the arrows pointing the direction of attack around it. She had an email message that discouraged her. It was from the granddaughter of Clara Lancaster Jones. "Sorry to inform you that Clara passed away yesterday of natural causes. She was so hoping for your success. She called her parents that evening and told them about her search, that she hoped to learn something soon. She asked them to tell Dr. Sims, should he call. A sober doctoral candidate trudged to the Morrow farmhouse at 9 a.m. the next morning. It was June 23rd, coincidentally, a warm day again. Jacques answered the door immediately. He was clean-shaven, she noticed. Hello, Miss Finch. How are you today? It looks like we have a great day for a walk in the woods. We do. Jacques, are you ready to go or do you need to get the kids, or what? She asked. The kids are with their father, at my request. He works when he feels like it, which is rarely, so he did not mind having his own children. My father is visiting his best friend, a lady. I have no knowledge what he could be doing, but I suspect. I have plenty of water for us, and some sandwiches if it gets to lunch or you just want to eat. Are you ready? Trish smiled. He wanted to be alone with her. Please, I'm ready. I have some water also, some granola bars, and my first name is Patricia. My friends call me Trish. No one calls me anything but Trish. It's good to know you have no enemies, he said, smiling and closing the door. They went around the house and followed a track through the crops. Did you learn anything about the papers last night? He asked her as they reached the edge of the field 20 minutes later. He helped her up the rocks there, a pile probably removed from the fields over the years. I think so. I think the platoon's last known location was the ridge or spur here. GPS will confirm that in a few minutes, but it has to be so. My advisor and I went over the maps pretty thoroughly back home. They climbed a gentle slope and then followed a small ravine for 100 yards when Jacques stopped. They were among trees, but not old growth by any means. Did you recognize the trench? We've been in it for 100 meters or so. She was surprised. She thought it natural. No, I didn't. This is not a frontline trench, is it? It was grassy. The bottom was not mud but seemed to drain. No. It was a trench to get to the big ones. It used to be filled with water much of the year, so I dug an outlet down there, he said and pointed to where they'd entered. It worked. Cut down on mosquitoes, and kids even come here to see a trench from the war once in a bit. Is it safe to play here? I mean, those old bombs. She said. He stopped and looked at her. The Germans were here, took this ridge early in the war. The British tried to take it back and did, finally. In 1918, an American unit was here. The Germans were just the other side of the valley. He pointed north. He didn't go on, just stood there in the trench. He finally said, my sister found Sherry and Jean digging up a Martin Hale's No. 2 hand grenade. Right over there at the base of the hill, he said, pointing down the slope near where they'd entered the trench. She took it from them, made them run to our house, and was putting it down when it went off. Not a huge bomb, but enough if one is not lucky. It had probably been there 96 years, working its way to the surface. He was quiet. Trish felt his anguish. They used radar then in the area, but who knows if that is thorough? No, it's not safe. They continued walking up the increasingly shallow trench to the top of the ridge, or spur. Really, the trench just ended among scrub trees and tangled undergrowth. There was no trench here, nothing but uneven dirt and rock and trees growing haphazardly, as if the ground were churned long ago. They walked further up the ridge, along its northern military crest, as Dr. Sims had explained to her. They picked their way around that mound and this pile, higher, toward a hill in the distance. To the right was a huge depression, many yards across and several deep. Trees and bracken were thick, and water filled the bottom. The ground leveled then, but with a slight depression running the length of the ridge. Getting through the bracken was a problem still at times. Stickers and thorns took a toll, and even though in long sleeves and pants, both of them were pricked and scratched and had spots of blood on hands, arms, and legs. Trish stubbed her toe and stepped on some small rocks just below the ground cover, uncomfortable but no problem. It happened again a few yards on. Farther on was another large depression, this one with brackish water in the bottom. There were other small holes along the way. Artillery? Trish wondered and came to assume. As they reached where the ridge/spur joined the hill, Jacques grabbed her hand and led her around a distinctive rock. On it was carved, barely discernible now, Finch 1931. He's buried about 5 feet down right there. I've been told, he said, pointing under the base of the rock. She stopped and looked. Dross, leaves, and detritus covered the spot. It was large enough, if they'd not encountered other rocks. I was told there was a large depression, shell hole, so the digging was practically done. They just cleaned it out and then filled it in. She ran her hand over the name on the rock. She took a picture with her phone, hoping the resolution would show the chiseled name. She leaned close to the rock. "Where are your men, Uncle Billy?" she whispered, hoping it was not noticed. Jacques could not hear, but he saw her. He didn't ask, but she answered, "Let's walk down the spur again." They did. After about 50 meters, they stopped and pulled the tangled weeds apart and looked at the ground. Standing on one of those protruding rocks, Trish pushed off and it moved, just a bit. Getting down on hands and knees, she cleared around the protrusion she'd stepped on, and Jacques looked on from above, ripping and pulling vines away. She dug around the projection and she realized it wasn't a rock. She recalled she'd stepped on several of these protrusions, stubbed her toes several times. She gave a cry. It was the muzzle of a rifle. "What is it?" Jacques said, "They're here, below our feet. The lost platoon." She spoke in English, not realizing, and then she translated for him. The bayonets had been removed by Billy, perhaps after the incident with Mr. Moreau, but the muzzles remained, some above and some an inch or so below the surface. She cried then, not a lady's sad cry, but the wailing cry of a mother who has lost a child and just found the body. She wailed for a father finding a son or daughter deceased, for all those mothers and fathers and wives and brothers and sisters who died without knowing what happened to their child or brother far away. First she was frantic, scraping with her fingertips at the dirt around the muzzles of the rifles, finding 1, 2, 7, more and more, and there they were lined up, prepared to attack. Concussed and suffocated and dead. She imagined them seated on the fire step, rifle but on the bottom of the trench, bayonet sticking 16 inches beyond the rifle, perhaps 10 or 14 inches above the soldier's helmeted head. She imagined them now as skeletons just below her feet. Their attack never left the trench because it collapsed, inhuming them. Jacques held her, kneeling in the bracken, and she leaned against him. He realized the horror of this place he'd lived near his whole life. How awful, she thought. They've been here all along. Americans, he thought. He stroked her hair until she was calm. They retraced their steps to his house, slowly, now early afternoon, holding hands, and she sometimes leaned against him. Then he put his arm around her. Trish was exhausted, as much by the emotional wrenching she'd felt as the mile or so they'd walked. They sat together on the couch, resting, not wanting to talk about bombs and wars, or so many dead men, or his sister, or wars long ago and still killing good people. It yanked at her. His sister died for a war quickly being lost to memory, leaving 2 little ones. They kissed as if kissing would push thought away. His hand worked its way under her shirt. There was a need in her from so much emotion. She felt him through his pants, and he was hard, so hard. "Have you a condom?" she asked. "We," he said. They were against each other, kissing hard, painfully. He tore at her clothes and she his. He kissed her. He had a condom, and she saw him putting it on. "Good, hurry, Jacques," she said, pulling him over from the couch. He thought that she was beautiful and sexy. Soon she was groaning with his fullness. "Yes, please, yes," she said, and things like it. Loving the pure concentration on her sex, she turned and pulled him by hand to the couch, where she lay back. She had never done this, not like this, not with someone she hardly knew, and for a moment she wondered at her willingness. She pushed her wonder aside. She said, "Do it. I want to feel it." Jacques. They both had wild and amazing sex. They relaxed. They were together for some time, half naked, as he softened, and still she loved the moment, the warmth, the touch of a man with her. It was as if she were alive again, no longer surrounded by so much young death. They rested side by side, slumped on the couch. After some time, she spoke. "It was wrong, Jacques. I don't know you. You don't know me. I don't know why." Jacques smiled and said, "You are beautiful. We are young. You have lived with this painful event for a long time. I do not have someone in my life. No woman." She thought of Ryan. Always Ryan. "It will not. Please, don't." She started and stopped, unsure what she wanted to say. "I will tell no one. For me, it will be a great and secret joy," he said. He kissed the air. "Perhaps when my grandpa asks me about today, I may wink at him, but I will never admit it. I did not expect it. Perhaps I hoped, though, he smiled. She walked back to Rochambeau later that afternoon. She insisted Jacques let her go alone. She needed to think. She had not understood her emotions, nor the interplay of so many, so much, and so rampant. Perhaps her empathy for the families of the lost platoon affected her emotionally. She didn't regret it, she was even glad for it. But she wanted that passion with her next lover, or perhaps husband, not a man she hardly knew. Jacques was in the right place when all the sadness and loss of love overwhelmed her judgment. The emptiness of this trip, without Ryan, added to the loss of the platoon so long ago. She wanted it to be her honeymoon. Now Ryan was gone, and it was a trip to a graveyard. She was no dispassionate historian. She smiled. Boy, did you get lucky, Jacques? She thought he'd agree. Perhaps I did too, she thought. Losing the sky gray platoon. It was a cool day in early March 1918. That 23-year-old Billy Finch stood before his platoon. It was the end of their final leave before transport to France, and the platoon was drawn up in the square beside the train station. Often the train didn't stop in Sky Gray, but today it had been arranged. The crowd, mostly family of the young soldiers, was impressed. The uniforms were sharply pressed and clean. No Irish pennants flew, every boot gleamed. Billy Finch was a stickler. He was leading 42 men, mostly of Sky Gray, Greenville, and Eton into the Great War, and he was determined they would look, act, and fight like American soldiers should, like Ohio and Indiana soldiers should, like Sky Gray soldiers should. The families were standing to the side, in an area marked for them. Billy, in front of the platoon, called it sharply to attention, and with a slap, the platoon was stiff. He waited a moment and announced to the platoon that he would speak to their loved ones. Parade, rest, Billy said in a tone he reserved for parade commands. His soldiers assumed that stiff but more relaxed position with hands clasped behind them. He walked over to the families and spoke quietly. He went to each in the crowd. Each name he said, a man or woman stepped forward. He shook each hand and said, I will leave no one behind, as long as I live. It took a long time, longer perhaps than he had intended, but each father or sister or wife or mother had Billy Finch's promise that a beloved boy would not be left behind on the battlefield. It was not so remarkable a promise. Many military leaders had made it in wars stretching back to Megiddo, but it was seldom possible to keep it. Many of the parents must have thought, my God, he's just a kid himself. He stood in front of his men then and called them back to attention. Attend, huh, he yelled in that voice that made his mother smile. Billy, acting important. He spoke to all, including his men. I paraphrase now the words of Colonel Stanton from last summer, July 4, 1917, as he stood before the grave of the Marquis de Lafayette. We pledge our hearts and our honor in carrying the war to a successful conclusion. Lieutenant Finch then looked solemnly at his men. As I told your families, I will not return without all of you. He looked at them seriously. A band played then, and a singer rendered a verse of the Star-Spangled Banner. In Little Sky Gray, many moms and dads checked mailboxes every day in the hopes of one last letter finally reaching them from New York, or after some weeks from Portsmouth or Le Havre in France. Finally it happened, and little Timmy Brown's postcard arrived from France, and word quickly spread to the other 14 families of Sky Gray doughboys, and from them to the parents of boys from all the little towns in eastern Indiana and western Ohio now that telephone service connected the towns. Other letters arrived from various boys and were shared or mentioned or cherished. Billy Finch's mother received a long letter in May detailing the trip, seasickness and cold waters and seeing Ireland in the distance, smells and tastes he'd never experienced before. His last paragraph informed her they were moving up. She was not familiar with that phrase, but she felt its ominous implication. It was 1918 and the war was 4 years old. Billy was excited to be part of it. The Yanks were there, trained as well as Pershing could and eager. Billy, his mother cried out in her husband's arms. Dad cried too, in his way. Billy, please God, he thought. Please. Billy proved to be a strict leader, careful in every detail, and his platoon sergeant raised his eyebrow the first time he'd been surprised by his confidence. The sergeant had been in the Army most of a decade now and was 24, just a little older than his lieutenant and only a bit cynical about the merits of recent civilians in his army, and recent civilian lieutenants at that. He'd intended to ignore Billy Finch until such time as he trained him, molded him, perhaps broken him into the real army. But Billy was 23, only a year younger, and for some reason he was not impressed with his own ignorance of army ways, customs, techniques, methods, and life. He'd come gangbusters from officer candidates course, and Harvey Lancaster from God knows where Missouri had assumed him to be like the last lieutenant. Shy, open-eyed, and willing to learn from Sergeant Lancaster's experience. Lieutenant Finch was willing to learn, but it would be corrections for actions taken, a quiet explanation out of the view of the men, a cocked eyebrow at most. Soon a cherry relationship was founded. Harvey had to admit he'd not had a platoon leader like this one. Finch insisted on routine from making a bunk to reloading a rifle or fitting a gas mask. He insisted not as a petulant boss, but as a concerned, educated leader. Do it right. He demanded that all common combat equipment be worn according to regulations, and he'd measure that the gas mask was slung over the left shoulder to the right hip as designated, grenades clipped as he directed, ammunition in pouches as ordered, etc., etc., etc. Finch made everything into the tiniest, numbered steps, whether it was extracting and donning a gas mask or throwing a Mills bomb. Helmets were worn straight with chin-strap tints. A bayonet was not rusty, and the interior of the scabbard was clean. Rifles were carried at proper and uniform angles, and covered with a light film of oil. The platoon looked good. Lancaster raised an eyebrow approvingly. He feared that Lieutenant Finch might prove a bursting bubble of competence in the barracks, in field practice, or on the ship, and a sudden failure on the battlefield, so he reserved final judgment. Uniformity, practice, recitation. Finch tested his men constantly. Lancaster watched, carefully schooled his lieutenant in the proper relationship with his platoon sergeant, helped him, and stayed out of his way. Some new lieutenants were too close to their men. Some had played ball together, dated the same girls, that sort of thing that preceded Army life. It was hard to break those conceptions. He didn't know the lieutenant's background except that he came from the same small town as a lot of the men, though he'd been to college, unlike them. However, there was no inkling of prior relationships. Lancaster observed. He thought the lieutenant too good to be true, as he wrote in a letter to his mother near St. Louis. Placed on a lonely line, bordered by wetland on the west and scrub hill on the right, the sky gray platoon was put in an old German trench, 8 feet deep along the crest of a small rise. They modified it for its new purpose. The platoon worked. Billy was no slouch. Fields of fire were identified, stakes placed to identify them, and ranges. Lanes for attack were identified. Billy assumed they'd be taking it to the enemy who was rumored to be on the next rise. Indeed, some mornings and evenings they'd hear the clinking of pots and metal coming from the other side of the swamp. The trench had a new firing step now, low down and accessing cutouts in the parapet toward the enemy, and prepared exits for the next American attack. The trench wall was shored where it seemed weak. Boards and logs were found, and the sucking muck of the trench bottom was somewhat mitigated. Prepared for an attack, every man would rest the butt of his bayonet rifle on those logs or fire step. Behind it, a small parapet rose perhaps 3 feet above the forward trench parapet, unusually so, but Billy thought it might protect them from the occasional shells that landed in that direction. He looked at everything from the enemy's perspective one dangerous day, and the trench was largely unnoticeable. They had no barbed wire. "We're taking it to the enemy," the captain said. They weren't expecting the Germans to attack. The swamp to the west curved around the bottom of their rise to their front for 70 meters before drying. Perhaps that kept the enemy at bay. But they were as ready as virgin soldiers could be. Every day, the lieutenant checked 3rd Squad so 2nd and 1st got busy because he never checked just one. His men grumbled, but every man was working, every watch was checked, and every rule was obeyed. The men who had not known him decided they didn't like him much. Even some who knew him were tired of his fuss. Orders finally came for the long-awaited, long-expected attack. Preparations were made. Supplies moved up for weeks. The enemy had no inkling. The secrecy was intact. The generals were sure. There was no doubt it would surprise them. None. The platoon would leave the trench at the beginning of morning nautical twilight, angle about the swamp to the front, extend left to join with the rest of the company, and hopefully surprise the never-seen enemy unit on the far rise just as the dawn became light enough to see. Sergeant, at 0445 have them aligned along the step. Quietly, no lights. The order says secrecy is paramount. The enemy should have no idea before we arrive in their faces. I'll get back around 0515 from the final brief, notify of any changes, and we'll take off. Yes, sir, Lancaster said. 0445 hours. The next morning, Billy headed to company headquarters at the farmhouse 700 meters to the rear. It was pitch dark at 0330. He counted on Lancaster because he could. This last-minute meeting at company headquarters was a sign the captain was nervous. He wanted to know how Billy planned to get around the swamp to his front left. The captain looked at him after the other platoon leaders were dismissed and said, "You will cross the line of departure at 0530, Lieutenant, 5 minutes ahead of the rest of the company, so you can angle around the swamp and then extend left along the base of the rise." "Yes, sir, we've practiced it," Billy replied. "Hook up with the rest of the company and proceed uphill as soon as the artillery lifts." "Good luck," the captain said. A little after 0500, Billy left the company headquarters dugout, and new surprise was compromised as he negotiated the series of trenches that led to his platoons. When he was still a quarter-mile away, entering the communication trench, out of the silence he heard a tremendous boom such as he had never heard or imagined possible. A flash before him illuminated a wall of dirt rising, and then in darkness it fell when finally its impetus was overcome by gravity. He felt it in the air and earth that he leaned against for support. It went on for some seconds as tons of dirt fell back to earth, pummeling his helmet and shoulders, vibrating the crust, and then a regular staccato of shells exploding along his front and to his rear where the rest of the company was entrenched. A sickening feeling pervaded his gut as he was showered with mud from this shell and pebbles from that. The enemy seemed to have their old trench line measured by every gun, but now shifted fire to a new target. He continued on, as time for the attack was upon them. The communication trench up the ridge petered out then, just where it came to the crest among the broken trees of the old wood. It petered out. "Oh my God," he thought. It didn't intersect, it petered out. He explored for a half an hour, tripping over some bayonets sticking out of the ground, when he realized he'd found them all along, and he measured the line in the graying dark, the brightening sky, stumbling, careful not to fall on this bayonet or that. Oh my God! His conscience tore at him. Duty done, Billy Finch's good, strong mind, his good, strong character, fractured in a strange way. He felt it snap in his head. A searing pain rent his skull. They were his men. He'd made his promise. It was the last anyone of the AEF saw of the Sky Gray platoon. It was the last anyone of the AEF saw of Billy Finch. Sky Gray platoon lost, and our boys gone, were headlines in the Cincinnati Post and the Cincinnati Times-Star dated July 7, 1918. They recounted the platoon's actions to June 23rd, when it failed to attack as ordered, and a few days later every man in it was declared missing in action. Every man, from Second Lieutenant Billy Finch to Private Joe Smucker of Fort Wayne, Indiana, was feared lost. The official Army report said that on June 23rd at 0600 hours, the platoon lost contact with the rest of its company and battalion. The battle swept on a mile to the north and east, and that was that. An officer was detailed to investigate a few days later, but he couldn't even find their trench line with any accuracy. He decided the trench was obliterated in the shelling of that last battle, which it was. He had found it, unbeknownst to him. Among all the dead of modern warfare was added the lost platoon of Sky Gray, missing, hopefully captured. As the lists were exchanged, that final hope that the platoon was in enemy hands was extinguished, and they became missing, presumed dead. It was dusk when the captain and 2 men arrived. Finch watched that captain from the last of the woods. He called it Lafayette Woods, and decided not to point out the line of bayonets along the edge of the low ridge. He avoided the man, who looked for the trench line to the front of the ridge, then traced behind it to the communication trench, and then along the backside. The captain even walked over the top once, stepping between the bayonets. It would be dangerous here, he must have thought. But the officer didn't notice that it wasn't one bayonet sticking up but many, and in a line. difficult to see among the other detritus of war littering the area, the ground uneven from its recent churning by the German artillery. He didn't realize it was the trench, caved in on itself. His 2 men, both too old to be privates but nevertheless, he told to follow the edge of the swamp and look for signs. They carefully walked the route assigned to the platoon, to where it should have met up with the rest of the company, but saw no sign of them. They looked into the swamp pond but saw no one. No helmet, no canteen, no rifle, nothing human. After an hour searching, hearing the big guns now miles north, the captain gave it up. He had enough to write his report. The platoon was not at its last known location. He failed to mention the trench was obliterated. His mission was to search for the platoon. A few months later, another attempt was made to find the platoon, but it relied on the first search and failed also. A squad was ordered to backtrack the attack route to the pond from their first objective, the German trench on the rise northeast of the pond, and found nothing. 3 soldiers went into the cold pond, which turned out to be only a few feet deep, but found no evidence. Billy noticed each attempt to find the platoon, shook his head at the short search of the second and the laziness of the first. He thought he could name the soldiers seated on a firing step below each bayonet. First squad would be here, he thought, with Corporal Canali there, and next him Smith, Burgess, then Thomas, so on. Billy was fairly certain he could name each soldier based on squad position, all the way down the 100+ yards that the platoon delineated. Perhaps 1 or 2 out of order, here or there. He could name them. It was routine. He was a stickler. Billy shook his head, squatting among the carnage. He decided to write some things down. Buried? All of them? He asked, incredulous. Was it possible they were interred? He knew of a French unit supposedly lost that way. I found at least 15 muzzles before we stopped, Trish said. I'll of course go back tomorrow. Dr. Sims, after perhaps a half-minute wondering if it could be so, asked, You have a statement about what killed them, but you don't know what it means? Yes, sir. It's very brief. Shall I read it to you? She asked. Yes, of course. History is rarely so interesting as when a mystery is solved, Sims said from Ohio. Okay, here it is, 23 June 1918. At 0515 hours, I was at battalion briefing. Jack Johnson's? Platoon went west. I know where each man is, as I look to the north. There is a garden of knives. Added almost as an afterthought, was this statement, took bayonets, danger to children. Oh, among the things here are about 3 dozen old, rusted bayonets. Repeat that. Did you say Jack Johnson's? He asked. Yes, Jack Johnson, she said. Like the boxer. It was not possible to study World War I in America and not come across mention of the famous Black American champion. Dr. Sims was silent, but there was something in his breathing that conveyed excitement? Joy. It was as if he wanted to yell, but he was holding it in. Dr. Sims? Silent still. He was thinking. Emily, his wife, said that sometimes when he was very excited, as when she'd announced she was pregnant, he'd become quiet because he wanted to control himself, and he was afraid he couldn't if he reacted quickly. Jonas? She said, using his first name for the first time and not noticing. You did it, he said. I really thought no one would. No one could do it. You did it. What? What did I do? I mean, the remains, yeah, but you found the Sky Gray platoon. You found out how they died, why they were not found. Lieutenant Finch was not with them at the time and lived, but he saw it or heard it and figured it out. Just wow, Trish, he said, using her first name for the first time. Trish was glad that between the two of them they knew something. Okay, explain it now, Buster, or I'm gonna call Marks and figure it out with him, she said, smiling and knowing Marks would be the first one Sims would call. I'm just so happy you succeeded, Sims said. Look at the note. Jack Johnson was the heavyweight boxer, but his name was slang for heavy German artillery shells in World War I. Lieutenant Finch found the whole trench caved in on itself. He found no trench. His men are still in it, doing whatever they were doing. Going west was slang for dying, back during that war, like buying the farm or kicking the bucket in other slang. From the Garden of Knives thing, and your explanation about Finch tackling Moreau to protect him from a stake. His men had their rifles pointed up and the attack buried them with their bayonets sticking out of the ground. It happened one other time, although I thought it was a hoax. Trish was thinking, why didn't the French readers translate it and understand? Dr. Sims replied, perhaps they were not as knowledgeable of artillery. More likely the terms in English are slang, and they weren't familiar. Jack Johnson? Going west? She was thinking, yes, if the local translators didn't know the American or British slang terms, it could just confuse them. Suddenly, a wave of exhaustion and weakness swept through Trish. She knew where they were and how they died. I have to sit, she said. Jonas thought weakly. It was quiet, and Jonas wondered if he'd lost the connection. But then he remembered Trish Finch and her nature. He knew why he heard nothing from her. Empathy, real empathy, not imagination, in the face of devastation was not a hindrance, but neither was it the sole object. What mattered was how the historian handled it. I am so sorry, Jonas. I am shaking, she said softly after a minute. They were right under my feet. I stepped on their rifles. Jonas nodded. You actually touched them. He could feel her mood changing as she realized the magnitude of her success and the magnitude of their loss. I may need some time, Jonas. I think of them there under those rifles, waiting for the attack they never made. It must have been one horrific moment. To this day, they're frozen in that horrible moment. Their names. Billy knew where each would be. Dr. Sims was silent. Remember we talked about empathy, and that guy who transferred to sociology. What was his name? Jeffers? I was worried he'd try to date you. Do you remember what I said? She thought, tore her mind away from the horror of her discovery, and tried to think of a seminar 2 years earlier. Yes, you said something like, history saves the meaning of our lives. Their discussion was serious and distant, each hearing the phone buzz in the background. She volunteered the next, you think we study history because the people matter, even after 100 years. Yes, everyone. You see them as people, not names on a list. Now, the years don't really matter. You've uncovered the demise of 43 men. You're the first to understand the very incident that ended their lives. If only their families had known. He heard her breathing, but she didn't speak more. More time slipped by. They will now, late but resolved. It was a long time ago, Trish, but you know now that doesn't really matter. Yeah, he heard her say quietly. Jonas? Yeah? Is Emily there? Yes. Would you like to speak with her? Please. She heard him calling to Emily, perhaps explaining, and then Emily was on. They spoke for a long time. Jonas, how are you? Emily? And how's our girl in Gaul? Said Tom Marks. They spoke by telephone the day after Trish notified Jonas she'd found the platoon. Everyone's doing well, here, Tom. Emily's expecting, finally. Really? I'll buy some expensive cider, and we'll share a drink next we're together. Yeah, Tom. Reason I called. Trish has found out what happened, and she's pretty sure she's found the remains. He explained what Trish found. Tom whistled when Jonas finished. My God. My God. Tom was actually speechless, even though a lawyer. Dr. Sims waited, knowing Tom's mind was always working on the next step. Jonas, what if we... And they talked for an hour about possibilities. May I tell Miss Finch what we want to do? Dr. Sims asked. By all means. With her, we could have wine. Marks laughed. Immediately upon hanging up, Sims dialed his student in Rochambeau, France. Bonjour, she said.
Très bien. Merci. À vous?
You're really getting into this French culture thing, aren't you, Miss Finch? Sims asked, with a smile. I am. Thank you. I spoke with General Marks. He thinks this is big news. If your French friends are amenable, he has an idea about the last resting place of the lost platoon. We'll need the support of the French government, but since it's an undeveloped area anyway, and the agreement of the families, he spoke to her then for a half an hour, explaining the idea, the practicality, the way it might happen as he understood it. Trish sat down as they talked. She controlled herself enough. It was overwhelming. She was working on a history degree, and this came of it. She'd have to talk to Jacques and his father. Late that evening, she sent an email to Evelyn Jones Bradley, west of St. Louis. I know Clara is past, but I wanted you to know. We found the lost platoon. For the first time, Ryan, I think my profession is more important than yours. He thought about that a lot, over most of a few years. History more important? It didn't make sense, but he knew she was reasonable in her own mind. He wanted to dismiss it as an academic prejudice, but it was so out of her character to be that. His mother eventually explained it to him. Mrs. Armbruster watched her son. He was in his second year of residency in Salt Lake, but he'd lost something. His first joy at being in the Rockies again didn't seem to make him happy now. He was moody and quiet. He visited Denver over the Christmas holidays, but she wondered why. He loved seeing his sister and her family, but it was her family, not anything he'd built. They were actually 2 hours closer to Salt Lake City, but Ryan only visited there twice because she had a life with her husband and children. He had friends and dated some, but nothing seemed serious but his mood. Mrs. Armbruster thought Ryan may have misunderstood something. He'd broken up with Patricia, the Ohio girl she'd never met but for whom he'd had such high hopes. It had been a year and a half of his residency. She thought that was long enough to mope. It was unlike him. She knew he had a capacity to care. It had led him to a career in medicine, but in all that talk about keeping distance from patient and avoiding entanglement, he'd confused something, she was sure. She wondered about Patricia Finch. "Ryan, sit with me," she said. He knew she wanted to talk. He sat beside her on the couch. After a few seconds, she said, "Tell me about Trish." He looked away. "There's nothing to say, Ma. I thought I was in love with her, but I don't think she loved me. She was fun and athletic and smart. I told you she was working on a PhD in history. We were starting to talk about getting married, but then she decided she didn't love me." Mrs. Armbruster didn't think her son was a liar, but for some reason that answer sounded like a canard. She nodded and held his hand. "Why'd you take the job at Salt Lake?" she asked. "I mean, you and she were still together yet you came west for residency?" "Yeah, I applied around out here. I wanted to be near the family, in the mountains. You know how it is out here. And with Salt Lake and Denver you have so many shows and sports. Skiing." His mother listened. "Out here? What did she want? Did you break up with her because you wanted to ski?" She didn't believe that, and she wanted him to get angry instead of talking as if it were fate. She didn't believe in fate until people made it. "No, that's silly. You want to know why we broke up? Is that what this is about?" She nodded. "I do, but not just because I'm nosy. I remember how wonderfully you described her on the phone and when you came for visits. What happened?" Ryan looked nowhere. He looked somewhere out there. She was about to start her dissertation, the last step in her degree, he said. She was going to have to visit France. She was studying some boys who were sent to World War I from her hometown, Skygray. Did I mention that town? His mother nodded. She wanted to talk about arranging her trip, so we could be together, maybe get married. I told her I accepted the residency in Salt Lake City and... He felt his mother look suddenly at him and stiffen. His mother slapped his leg, probably as hard as she was able. He looked at her. "Hey." It stung for some seconds. She was mad. She wanted to talk about arranging her big trip, maybe with you. "And you told her you had already accepted the position out here?" she asked. "Yeah," Ryan said. "So?" She got up and said, "Just stay there and think for a minute. I'll be back." She came back a few minutes later with a beer and a newspaper folded up. She handed the beer to him. Before she sat down, he started up again. He defended himself, saying, "She has to accept that my career is important. Lives matter. I'm a surgeon. Mine has got to take precedence. Any girl I marry has to realize that. Even Dr. Patricia Finch." His mother nodded. "You think she was saying that if you got a call to come to a bleeding patient, she'd say, 'But we're having supper,'" she asked. He smiled. "No, nothing like that. But Salt Lake was an opportunity, a great one." "Oh, honey," his mother said. "She said that I should not have made that decision without talking to her first, and then she broke up with me," he said. He felt like crying, but instead he leaned his head on her shoulder. "Moms are great." His mother smiled. She wasn't saying your career wasn't important. She was saying that her life had to be important to you, too. He was quiet for a moment. She opened the Denver Times to the front page. "Is this she?" his mother said, pointing to a picture on a story below the fold about a new American cemetery being built on an old French battlefield. "Lost platoon to rest in France," the headline read. Ryan looked carefully. It showed unseen exhumations being supervised by Dr. Patricia Finch of the American Monuments Commission. Trish looked beautiful and smart and capable. Ryan nodded and read the article. He finished and put his head against her shoulder again. I told her my career was more important, that I save lives, he said. His mother resisted the urge to hit his leg again. And what does she save? She said. She thought to herself, I sure would like to meet this girl. She was pretty, and her statements in the story were intelligent. He was quiet, thinking. She saves their moment, he realized. Ryan nodded with his cheek against her shoulder. Ma, he said quietly and slowly, when did I become arrogant? She didn't answer directly. You get it from your father, honey. I like seeing Sis and her kids, and you and Dad, but it's not like it was, he said. The past is always with us, but it never comes back, she said. You had a great childhood, but it's over. Remembering is as good as it gets. Oh, and creating those memories for others, that's pretty great too. Ryan spoke. I was a fool. Again, your father, she said, and they smiled. It was quiet for a few minutes. They heard his father pulling into the garage. Soon everyone would be coming over for supper. He thought, everyone but one. Is she involved with anyone? His mother asked. Ryan shrugged. He avoided asking Jackson, not wanting to seem obsessed almost 2 years later. I don't know. She's pretty. She probably has a boyfriend. Maybe a husband. Can you find out? His mother asked. I can email Jackson, a friend of hers and mine in Ohio. I think I'll do that. He kissed his mother on the cheek and said, Thanks, Ma. What's for supper? His father asked, seeing them in the living room sitting side by side. Ryan answered, Crow. Mrs. Armbruster slapped his thigh again, much more lightly, and laughed. His father smiled. Must be Tuesday. Ryan emailed Jackson. Ah, the idiot finally coming to his senses? Yeah, she has me, and that Sims guy, and now some Marine general who's a confirmed bachelor. Any one of us would go for her. I'll tell her you asked. Ryan smiled at the joke. Dr. Sims's wife was Trish's friend. Ryan knew the general from Trish's talk, and she was much too young for him, he hoped. And Jackson played the field for a different team. None of that really mattered. Ryan loved Trish, and just the idea made him feel better. It mattered. Love was actually something. It may not save a life, but it gave it meaning. An American Army band played marches as people arrived, strolling up the length of the spur. There was pavement, so a few old or infirm were pushed in wheelchairs. There were hundreds, perhaps 1,000, standing about the grass lawn of the lower ridge on the northeast side of the Morrow farm. Many were seated in white, folding chairs in ranks before a portable podium with a lectern. They included at least one representative of every family of a member of the Sky Gray platoon, paid for courtesy of a charity organized for the purpose by the veterans of foreign wars. Many other family members paid their own way, using the opportunity to visit Europe. Some were interested in the history of World War I, some were French or American government officials. There were French people from Rochambeau, who'd wondered at the mystery of the ridge as children. Other Frenchmen were there out of simple interest or decency. An Ohio congressman made the trip, as well an Indiana senator. The mayor of Skygray and her family were there. A German government official was present, also, gregarious and introducing his family. An American platoon was drawn up in ranks to the left of the podium, currently at parade rest. A French honor guard faced the audience to the right. An American honor guard was at parade rest to the left. There were flags. It was breezy on Crete Fall. The American flag, flying on a pole at the far end of the ridge, snapped noisily in the wind when the band was quiet. A French flag flew beside it. The larger trees were saved, trimmed, cleaned up. The bracken was cleared, vines and thorns removed or cut back. The uneven ground had been carefully smoothed, replenished and sodded, but not leveled. Unlike most military cemeteries, the ground undulated from grave to grave, from squad to squad. To the right were two very large craters, 50 yards apart, and numerous smaller. All had drainage. There was a small parking lot behind a copse at the southwest rise of the hill, hardly visible in the summer foliage. Perhaps the only problem with the site was that it required a steady uphill walk. There were several American Army officers. People straggled up from the parking lot until there were too many to be a straggle. Most wore casual clothes, but not their worst. Women were in summer dresses, men in pullover shirts, a few in sport coats. The wind blew the dresses and a few hats had to be pinned on. Finally, the band played the French and American national anthems, and people sat in chairs or stood about quietly. A French government official spoke first over a temporary loudspeaker system of tragedy commitment leading to the close relationship of the American and French people. A retired U.S. Army general and now head of the American Battlefield Monuments Commission spoke. "We are so happy that all the families agreed to leave their loved one in situ," he said at one point. "We think it is appropriate in this extraordinary circumstance." Each remains was exhumed, ammunition and ordnance removed, and replaced but prone, resting. When possible, identities were checked based on the only known document and identity tags when present. Each remains was treated with the utmost respect. He paused. He introduced the next speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, the historian who finally and correctly discovered the ultimate resting place of the lost platoon of the American Expeditionary Force, Dr. Patricia Finch." Trish left the group she was sitting with. Tom Marks in full dress uniform, Jonas and Emily Sims with an 18-month-old child, Jacques Moreau, and his father, now 101 and very frail, her own father, mother, and surviving grandmother, the Moreau children Jean and Sherry with their father, and stepped onto the platform. She stepped up to the microphone and did not refer to her notes. She saw some she knew from her interviews. She nodded to Evelyn Bradley and made eye contact with one or two others. She looked out then on so many people, but one made her hesitate. She stared at the young man just behind the chairs in a suit. He was smiling. She was startled, but when he gave a little wave, she smiled and nodded. "Ryan." She spoke in French and translated each paragraph immediately into English, so her brief words took longer. "Good morning." It was called the Lost Platoon of Sky Gray, the Lost Platoon of Ohio, the Lost American Platoon of the AEF, or the Great War. After some time, no one called it by its actual designation. She started, smiling, which I admit is a mouthful. It was actually the 3rd Platoon, Company C, 1st Battalion, 156th Regiment, 2nd Brigade, 40th Division, United States Army, American Expeditionary Force. As you walk up the slope behind me, in just a few minutes, you'll notice that every man but one remains where he deceased. She hesitated a moment and went on. "They rest where they were buried in a stupendous bombardment that boiled the land behind me, even under us, collapsing their trench and interring them as they sat on their firing step, prepared to attack. You can see the shell holes of that great barrage. For them, combat was a few terrible seconds. These sons of Western Ohio and Eastern Indiana are still here, and always will be now. Their families were left wanting. They hoped for decades that somehow, someway, their platoon had survived, that someone had survived. Their moms looked up every time a doorbell rang for the next 50 years, hoping it was Andy or Paul or Charlie finally come home. I read one letter written in the 1950s by the sister of Andy Guardino, saying that she still thought, still hoped, he might walk in the back door someday, like he'd never left. She saw him as that 18-year-old kid brother who marched off to the tune of George M. Cohan. We know where Andy is now. He is under the 12th stone you will pass. They are all here, together. My great-uncle is the 43rd American soldier. He is buried just beyond the others, out of line, beside a rock now with a plaque identifying him, near the flagpole. He survived the bombardment that morning, but he wouldn't leave his men. I think their loss disturbed him. He lived out the last 13 years of his life on this little ridge, obsessed with a promise he made, to leave no man behind. He called this forest Lafayette Woods, and for those years he watched this ridge, watched the bayonets rust. When he saw kids playing here, he collected those bayonets and saved them. They were found with his body. He lived here begging for scraps, freezing in winter, until he could accompany them in death. He chose it. The people here called him the Madman. Children called this narrow spur Madman Ridge. Mr. Moreau, to my left, actually met him once as a young boy on this ridge. She shook her head, smiling a sad smile. She avoided more maudlin statement. There is a famous epitaph recorded in Herodotus about the dedication of soldiers lost in battle far from home. It's read in most schools, in one curriculum or another. It translates, "Go tell the Spartans, Passerby, that here, obedient to their word, we lie. She stopped and looked around and then back at the crowd. We are the passers-by, for these are dead of the Great War. It's up to us to remember them and tell. She waited a long pause. Ryan had his hands behind him, looking straight at her. One last thing. Since the decision to maintain the combat graves of our soldiers, it was decided that next year, from June 23rd and for each of the next 42 days, a different flag will be flown at the tomb of the unknown soldier in Arlington National Cemetery to be presented to a family member of each of our lost soldiers, no longer unknown, by rank from lowest to highest in ceremony. Further information will be sent you, so check your email when you see my name. Thank you all for coming. The entire area and whole farm have been searched by radar and sonar for unexploded ordnance. But use caution. As you passed up from the lot, you must have noticed the marker for Amy Moreau Durand, who died on that spot just 6 years ago from a hand grenade thrown in 1914. She saved her children in doing so. She was the granddaughter, wife, mother, and sister of the 6 Moreaus and Durands you see seated with us. Her brother Jacques called hers the last death of the Great War. She paused and looked at Ryan. Let us hope so. We may venture among the graves now, but try to stay on the walkways. The cemetery gates will close at dusk, open at 8, every morning. There will be a caretaker on premises during normal working hours. Oh, and if any of you would like to talk to me, General Tompkins or other members of the Monuments Commission, or the Moreaus who have lived with our relatives so long, please feel free. I offer translation help if you need it. There was polite applause. Trish pushed her hair away from her eyes, looking out at Ryan. She signaled him not to go away. She left the platform and went to her friends and family. The crowd broke into groups and began moving up the slope, looking at their brochures and finding a relative long past. May I have a moment? She said to Dr. Sims, Emily, and her family. There's someone here I need to see. They smiled, of course, and turned up the slope. The band began to play again. She walked to Ryan then, and they were alone among the many. Nothing else to do. So you thought you'd pop over to France today? She said, smiling. No. Decided I wasn't a kid anymore and wanted to see if you'd believe it. He looked at her eyes and then around. He waved his hand. Wow, Trish. Just stupendous. Trish looked back at his eyes. Every moment seemed to inspire thought. She appreciated the gesture, but did it change anything? 2 years later? It'll be like starting over. It may take a long time, Trish said. I still have work in Washington and Ohio. Well, it turns out I have work there, too. And you're worth the time. I figured something out. Just like there's history everywhere, there are people who need surgeons everywhere. I thought you wanted to be near your family. He smiled and looked at her directly. Mom told me I was trying to recapture my childhood. I contacted your friend Jackson, and he said you were not married or engaged. Called me an idiot. He shook his head. Seems to be a lot of that. He shook his head with a smile and wondered how he'd survived without her eyes for 2 years. He thought for a minute. My mom wants to meet you. Dad too. I think he already has a crush on you from a story in the paper. He said, You left this girl? He acted astounded. Trish canted her head and looked at him, thinking there were worse things than being called a fool. She said, Decisions need to be made together. He nodded. I look forward to the compromises. She reached out her hand, took his. Walk with us. I'll introduce you around. Mom and Dad'll be surprised to see you again. Beyond the speaker's platform were the renovated resting places of the lost platoon. 42 uniform headstones, as were used in many American national cemeteries, were aligned with the military crest of the spur and each other, but not perfectly spaced. The stone of each man was with each man as First Lieutenant Billy Finch Best listed him in 1918. He was a stickler. Only Sergeant Harvey Lancaster had to be sought. He was found with the second squad. Beyond the last headstones, to the right as they looked up the slope, Trish and her group headed. The Sims toddler toddled, slowing everyone. No one cared. General Marks walked silently, reading every name and word carved in the stones. The group straggled up the slope. Ryan was moved by the seriousness, the solemnity. Family groups were gathered here and there, talking quietly. A few had old pictures to share. He held onto Trish's hand, knowing acceptance would take time. Time he looked forward to spending with her. People stopped to speak with her, to introduce themselves, to give or get email addresses. He discovered he was proud to be with her. Their group finally gathered together at the large rock beyond the other graves. Trish looked around at them all, waiting for everyone to close up. Trish's mother and father were next to her, and her grandmother Finch. Her Aunt Sheila Gray was coming up with her husband and some cousins. The general stood behind, Dr. Sims and Emily with their child to one side. Embedded in the big rock was a plaque, identifying the final resting place of the madman of Lafayette Dubois. Trish turned and put her hand on the rock, by the old carved name Finch. Loud enough for everyone to hear, she said, "Uncle Billy, we are here." Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.